Hello everyone and welcome to National Army Museum for today's Friday Insights. The museum is the national home of the history and heritage of the Army, a place where you can experience the story of the Army from the perspective of those who have served in it. There are many ways you can support the work of the museum. You can buy a book in our shop, visit the cafe, donate, or become a member, where you get your exclusive discounts and your very own events programme. But I'll tell you more about that at the end. Now today I'm delighted to welcome back to the museum Dr. Eamon O'Keefe. Eamon is a National Army Museum Research Fellow at the University of Cambridge. His research interests include military music, duelling, and broader connections between war and society in Georgian Britain. Today, Eamon will be exploring the War of 1812 through the eyewitness accounts of a disabled British veteran of the conflict. Now, before I hand over to Eamon, a few technical points. Firstly, online audience, should you have any issues, be they big or small, I highly recommend refreshing the browser. Generally solves all the issues. Any problems, post them in the chat and we'll do our best to give you a hand. Secondly, if you do have a question for Eamon at the end, post them in the chat and I'll raise them with him then. Finally, tech issues do sometimes arise and we do try and fix them as quickly as possible. Should there be any issues, we'll come to stop the talk and keep you guys informed. With all that said, can I have a massive round of applause for Eamon O'Keefe?
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out on this slightly miserable rainy day to hear this talk. I hope you won't be disappointed. So what I'm going to be speaking about is the War of 1812, which is a conflict that's not much remembered here in Britain. But in North American history, in the US and especially Canada, it's seen as a very important nation-making episode. The Napoleonic Wars at the time were ravaging Europe, but on a much grander scale. But at the same time, from 1812 until early 1815, the United States invaded Britain's Canadian colonies and then faced British incursions in turn. Neither side, when the dust settled, could claim a clear victory. In fact, it's still a popular subject of debate in the US and Canada to argue who won the War of 1812. But what we can say is the conflict meant that Canada would remain part of the British Empire, and it also diminished Indigenous resistance to American westward expansion. There was a big coalition of Indigenous people that were fighting as British allies, and they were badly damaged as a result of this war. Now, in a former life, I spent a decade interpreting the War of 1812 at a historic British fort in Toronto, in Canada. And among the colorful cast of characters who took part in this conflict, one relatively humble figure's name kept cropping up in books, in museum displays, and even television documentaries, as you can see here. Shadrack Byfield was an English weaver and a war amputee with a wonderfully biblical name. He secured a place for himself in the history of this war by publishing a memoir of his experiences as a private soldier. Byfield's rare rank-and-file narrative of the fighting has often been quoted, anthologized, reprinted. There's even a Canadian children's novel with a fictionalized Byfield as its main character. And I actually remember reading that in my sort of primary school library and being very fascinated, transfixed with this period of history. The author, as you might expect, has repeatedly been valorized as a heroic defender, as a heroic archetype, rather, of the red-coated defenders of Canada who helped ward off this particular American attempt to make Canada the 51st state. According to an editor of his memoir writing in 1963, Byfield's story, quote, could have been told by any one of those humble, patient, iron-hard British regulars whose devotion to duty made them face danger with serenity. That was pretty thumping stuff. But remarkably little has actually been known about this soldier's later life, at least to this point. Shadrack Byfield has been assumed to be illiterate, with his memoirs recorded perhaps by a patron or an employer. He supposedly died around 1850, with leaving his family destitute. But over the last few years, I've managed to uncover an incredible wealth of information on this veteran, tracing him in newspapers and archives on both sides of the Atlantic, and even identifying a previously unknown second memoir written by this veteran recounting his travails after leaving the Army. And in my talk today, I'll aim to question the received view of Byfield as a plain-spoken embodiment of the stoic soldier. I'll chronicle his efforts to secure a livelihood and also consider how war shaped this veteran both mentally and physically. Now, this is a story, of course, about one particular individual, but I also hope it opens a window into the broader experiences of homecoming veterans after the Napoleonic Wars. As the historian Evan Wilson has recently noted, the habit of writing books which begin or end with Waterloo, the Battle of Waterloo, has tended to obscure the presence of hundreds of thousands of ex-servicemen in British society after 1815. We see them at the downfall of Napoleon, then they seem to exit stage right, and we don't seem to hear quite as much about most of them in the decades that followed. Some authors portray veterans as marginalized figures, and they highlight the very real economic hardship caused by rapid demobilization. But on the other hand, there's a study, for example, of Scottish military pensioners, which suggests that they settled back into civilian society with actually surprising ease. Several historians have identified the wartime expansion of welfare provision for servicemen and their families, including, say, the Duke of York School for soldiers' children, just down the road. And they've also examined literary and artistic depictions of old soldiers, both as reassuring personifications of working-class patriotism, but also as disturbing embodiments of war's baleful effects. And to illustrate this, we can see this on one of the slides, two starkly contrasting images from the 1790s. On the left, you can see a grim image of John Bull, who leaves his family, goes off to fight. His family are forced to pawn all their belongings. He comes home emaciated and disfigured. The other print shows also a lost leg, but presents a much more comforting aura of domestic bliss around this veteran. We even see a young son shouldering his father's crutch as if it were a musket, showing that he's aspiring to a military career, isn't necessarily put off by what happened to his father. And interestingly, while we probably tend to think of veterans of the First and Second World War as being reluctant to discuss their experiences, the opposite stereotype prevailed a century earlier. Former soldiers were satirized and mocked for endlessly refighting past battles. You can see yet another print here on the screen where we've got a soldier talking about the Battle of Dettingen. You can also see he's got a wooden leg, very excitedly pointing to Cumberland, his commander, and the clergyman over there is yawning and sort of nodding off and is quite bored by hearing this story at great length. Now, given this image of the veteran as a garrulous storyteller, you might not be surprised that historians have identified this time, this period after the Napoleonic Wars, as the moment in which the military memoir became a recognizable and mainstream genre of literature. An avalanche of autobiographies by former combatants met with a receptive audience both in Britain and throughout Europe, reflecting a shift in war writing away from impersonal campaign histories that just, this battle happened, then we marched here, to more a narrative that is focused on individual experience. That becomes a lot more popular. For the first time, significant numbers of ordinary soldiers are venturing into print, a phenomenon which owed much both to rising literacy rates, but also increased public interest in the sacrifices of ordinary rank-and-file servicemen. It's tempting for historians, of course, to take these memoirs at face value, to trawl them for anecdotes and battles of particular campaigns. I know I've done so myself. But as Matilda Gregg, who works at this museum, has emphasized, soldier authors were not simply unworldly men writing in search of personal catharsis. They were skillful storytellers who made deliberate decisions about what to include and exclude from their narratives. They published in pursuit of deliberate goals, which might be personal profit, maybe it's political reform, army reform, or political advancement. But tracing the publishing plans and also the post-war lives of former officers has, of course, proven far easier than uncovering those of military autobiographers of lower ranks. By examining Byfield's case, we can chart a veteran's path to publication in considerable detail and examine how his self-presentation shifts over time in print. So let's begin by exploring our subject's early life. Shadrack Byfield was born in the Wiltshire wool town of Bradford-on-Avon, near Bath, in September of 1789. He learned his father's trade of weaving, but followed in the footsteps of two older brothers by joining the Wiltshire militia, the county militia, in 1807, aged 18. Shadrack's mother was so distraught at her son's decision to enlist that, as the veteran would later remember, she fell into a speechless fit and died within days. After barely more than a year in the Wiltshire militia, much of it spent guarding French prisoners of war at Norman Cross, a big prisoner of war camp near Peterborough, Byfield decided to volunteer for overseas service in the regular army. He joined the 41st Foot and sailed out in 1809 to Canada to join them. Now, military service in the early 19th century, in many ways just like today, involved acquiring new trades and competencies very much beyond the obvious ones, like, say, drilling with weapons or marching in formation. While stationed in Quebec City, for example, Byfield learned to care for horses as a groom for a senior army officer. He was also encouraged to attain the literacy skills required for promotion to, say, corporal or sergeant by attending the regimental school. Byfield later remembered he declined, saying he was, quote, young and foolish at the time. But he was nonetheless selected for the Light Company, a skirmishing formation comprised of the regiment's most active and intelligent men. Later, he'd also be equipped with helping run the regimental canteen. Byfield was serving at Fort George along the Niagara River near Niagara Falls when the United States declared war in June of 1812. He took part in the siege of Fort Detroit, an important early British victory, and later claimed to have helped confiscate the colors of the 4th U.S. Infantry, which American officers were on the cusp of destroying after the garrison's surrender. And both of the colors are actually on display in the Regimental Museum in Cardiff Castle. You can see one example, the American Eagle here. Byfield was shot in the neck at the Battle of Frenchtown in January 1813, but he recovered in time to participate in further unsuccessful British operations against American forts in what's now Ohio. He evaded capture after the British defeat at the Battle of Moraviantown in October, afterwards wandering in the woods in the company of indigenous warriors who he feared were intent on killing or abducting him. He was relieved to reunite with other fugitives from the 41st Foot, and then made his way to British lines on the Niagara frontier, taking part in several more cross-border battles and raids, sort of where it says Fort George, Fort Erie, Fort Niagara. That's a major theater of war back and forth across the river. He ends up being a seasoned soldier even at age 24. He was a survivor. As Byfield later recalled, out of the 110 men who began the war in the Light Company, only 15 remained with the colors 18 months later, the rest having been killed, wounded, captured, or deserted. And I've checked the muster rolls at the National Archives. His numbers are almost exactly on the money. This Wiltshire warrior also escaped unscathed from the confused nighttime fighting at Lundy's Lane in July 1815. That was the bloodiest battle ever fought on Canadian soil. But his luck ran out during a skirmish 9 days later, when a musket ball shattered his left forearm. Although the surgeons initially hoped to be able to save his limb to forego amputation, gangrene unfortunately set in, and Byfield's arm was sawn off below the elbow. He endured this lengthy operation, which was performed without any anesthetic at this time, of course, with little complaint, it seems. But then he erupted in anger on learning that his lost limb had been ignominiously discarded onto a dung heap. Feeling a strong urge to strike the offending medical orderly with his remaining fist, Byfield recovered his forearm and ensured it received a proper burial, nailing together a few boards as a makeshift coffin. Pretty remarkable. This insistence on due ceremony for a lost limb was not entirely unparalleled. Some of you might have heard of the case of Lord Uxbridge, whose amputated right leg was interred in a local garden after the Battle of Waterloo. And actually, the museum on the top floor has several relics of Uxbridge's amputation, including the saw and the handkerchief that was used in this gruesome operation. The resting place of Uxbridge's limb even became a macabre tourist attraction on the battlefield. There's a little gravestone saying, Lord Uxbridge's leg. But Uxbridge was a lieutenant general. Such consideration doesn't seem to have been accorded very often to soldiers of lesser rank. Their severed appendages were piled high after battles and discarded really as rubbish rather than as human remains requiring respect. I've come across one example of a lieutenant insisting on burying his leg in a similar fashion in 1813-14, but no other cases of an ordinary soldier endeavoring to do so. So Byfield's now disabled. He returns to England to be discharged, but not before his comrades clubbed together for a few pounds to help raise his transition, to help ease his transition into civilian life. He passes through army depots on the Isle of Wight, then at Chatham in Kent, and then he arrives at the Royal Hospital, Chelsea, almost exactly 1 year after his wound. Then he's considered for an army pension. Now, examination days at this hospital, which had been established by Charles II, for care of disabled soldiers, of course, it's just next door to this museum, were bustling affairs. On these days, these examination days, you've got motley crowds of veterans, survivors of campaigns really from all over the world, who are converging on the institution to await a medical assessment and a hearing, all different accents, people with all sorts of limbs missing, all sorts of stories to tell. So some amazing sort of anecdotes and stories that some veterans write in their memoirs about the hubbub that they face on this day. Now, a few of them could look forward to donning those iconic red uniforms and becoming live-in members of the hospital, living inside on premises. But the vast majority would become, rather than in-pensioners, that they become out-pensioners. They would live away from Chelsea and draw their either quarterly or monthly their stipend from the excise office, from sort of local officials. Soldiers often characterized their encounter with the Board of Commissioners at Chelsea as cursory and impersonal. In an account kept here in the Templar Centre and the archives at the museum, one prospective pensioner described having been ordered to stand inside a chalk circle and, quote, told not to speak without being asked a question by the board. Under regulations of 1806, men who'd served for set lengths of time were entitled to prescribed sums. So an infantry private could expect 5 pence a day for 14 years of eligible service. Or a shilling a day for 21. And if you were at Waterloo, you got 2 years extra counted towards your pension. If you were at the East or West Indies, because that was seen as a more dangerous or unhealthy posting, it was counted as time and a half. So there are formulas there, though, that are sort of fairly cut and dry. The problem is awards for disability and infirmity, they necessarily involve a lot more discretion on the part of the commissioners. Rather than just sort of totting up the years, they have to say, you know, how far is this individual unable to support himself? How much damage has been done to his earning potential based on the injury or disability that he has suffered? And the private soldiers' pensions would typically range from between 6p to 2 shillings 6p per diem, so a huge range depending on how much it was seen the disability had affected your ability to sustain yourself. Sergeant Thomas Jackson, who lost a leg in the Low Countries and appeared before the board on the same day as Byfield in August of 1815, he bitterly recalled how the panel, quote, eyed me up and down and seemed to consult for a moment when one of them said, oh, he's a young man, able to get his living. No questions were asked of me, but at sight I was knocked off with the pitiful reward of a shilling a day. Now, it should be emphasized that not all veterans were quite so aggrieved by the board's decisions. Others rejoiced at the measure of economic security that their pensions would provide, acutely conscious that this lifetime benefit would be envied by other working men. And again, these great vignettes of examination days, people say, you know, coming out of the hall, there are some people who's, yes, I can't believe it, this is an amazing amount, life-changing sum, I'll be able to open my own pub with some economic security, and others who think, I've lost an arm and this is all I'm getting. Byfield recalled himself being very much dissatisfied with his award of 9p a day, so that's less than £14 a year, especially because a bugler of his regiment who'd suffered a similar wound but experienced far less combat had received 3p more. Now, the board might have said, the bugler lost his right arm, you lost your left, but you know, the fact that everyone's being examined together, you know, creates these opportunities for saying, actually, I'm not sure this is fair. I've been shortchanged. Somebody else has been given, you know, a discretionary amount that is too much. Now, like many military veterans, Byfield returns to his hometown, and he promptly marries. His bride, Sarah Tucker, gave birth to the first of their 3 children in 1816. For 2 years, Byfield ekes out a living as a farm laborer, being prevented by the loss of his forearm from returning to weaving. One night, however, as the veteran would later write, Byfield dreamt of an instrument that would allow him to operate his loom despite his disability. And he commissioned a local blacksmith to realize the design. And I wish he said more about actually how this thing worked. But it was some sort of prosthesis, clearly, where as a weaver, you've got to use both of your limbs to be pulling back beams, moving the shuttle, and also your legs to be pushing up and down the pedals. And I think it was some probably attachment to the remainder of his forearm to be able to allow him to complete one of these tasks. So he's equipped with his new prosthesis, and he thereafter toils in a domestic workshop, just like this weaver here on the screen. He collects spun thread from a nearby mill, the Staverton Woolen Mill, as you can see here, a depiction of it from one of their merchants' bills, and then brings it home. He weaves it into finished cloth and then delivers it back. However, as with other ex-soldiers in this overpopulated trade, because weaving was semi-skilled, it was fairly easy to get into, and so a lot of soldiers are joining this career, but suddenly there's too many weavers, not enough work to go around. He finds that he doesn't have enough to support himself. He's often underemployed. So Byfield spends 2 winters working as a chairman. This is not as a corporate executive, as you might expect, but as a wheelchair attendant or a sedan chair attendant in nearby Bath. You can see an image of the assembly rooms where somebody's being pushed along by one of the chairmen. 2 other chairmen are actually pulling these sedan chairs. And I have to say, you know, given the steep streets of Bath, if you've ever been there, this really cannot have been easy work, especially for someone who's missing part of his arm. Now, according to his second, and very often they'd be sickly patients, typically visiting the spas, visiting the bath for health reasons, and this was a sort of manpower taxi service. So he does this during the winters, but according to his second memoir, Byfield found that the dissolute behavior of the lodgers and the chairman he was spending a lot of time with was repugnant in light of the growing religious convictions that he felt. Having been baptized into a local church, this ex-soldier, Byfield, he registers a dissenting Protestant meeting house under his own name with the authorities in Bradford in 1831. While navigating life as a civilian and grappling with matters of faith, Byfield pursues additional compensation for his military service and his wounds. He learns about Lloyd's Patriotic Fund, which is a philanthropic organization that offered financial support to wounded servicemen. He learns out about this from an old comrade in the militia. And then he sends off his application. He recalls how his soul leapt for joy on receiving the £15 for the loss of a limb in 1819. Remember, that's more than he's getting on an annual basis for his pension, albeit maybe scant compensation for such a big loss. Byfield repeatedly petitioned the Royal Hospital Chelsea for an increased pension. He felt he deserved more. He wanted the full shilling. He even borrows money to be able to go to Chatham for an interview with the Commandant General of what's known as the Invalid Department there. But none of these appeals bore fruit. He's not able to get anywhere. That said, in 1836, he makes some renewed efforts to raise his stipend. He pays a visit to a nearby field officer, Colonel William Napier, who lives close to Bradford on Avon and is known in Byfield's words as a soldier's friend. He's someone who helps veterans out with their casework, essentially. Now, Napier is a distinguished veteran of the campaigns in the peninsula. He fought alongside Wellington. And he was also well on his way by this point to becoming the preeminent military historian of 19th century Britain, really the Max Hastings of his days, tremendously popular history books, and writes extremely well and vividly. His political beliefs combined kind of Tory paternalism with radicalism. So he supported universal manhood suffrage, that is giving all men the vote regardless of their wealth, which was a pretty radical opinion for the day, especially for a man of his class. And he also eulogized the character and the bravery of the British private soldier in his writings. So in a typically romantic and especially controversial passage of his 6-volume History of the War in the Peninsula, Napier unfavorably contrasted the British Army with its more meritocratic French adversary. And I'll read that to you now. Napoleon's troops fought in bright fields where every helmet caught some beams of glory. But the British soldier conquered under the cold shade of aristocracy. No honors awaited his daring. No dispatch gave his name to the applauses of his countrymen. His life of danger and hardship were uncheered by hope. His death unnoticed. This is pretty strong stuff, and actually got many military officers were quite angry with this. This is also, he's writing this in the midst of the reform crisis over the reform bill, when politics and the questions of representation are huge. So to be launching this attack, didn't make him many friends. But his books were still hugely popular, regardless of whether people agreed with his politics. Now, as you can see from this, Napier, he's convinced that the rank and file haven't received their due, that the veterans are hard done by, they haven't been treated well. Unlike in the French army, they're not really given the time of day for their achievements. And so Napier, as you can imagine, is going to then be sympathetic to Byfield's appeal. He's kind of primed for this. This is already what he thinks. And the colonel then enlists the support of a regular correspondent of his to help Byfield out. This man is Lord Fitzroy Somerset, who'd himself lost an arm at Waterloo, and also often aided old soldiers at Napier's behest. Napier and Somerset are writing back and forth about the history, trying to figure out what happened, what date in the peninsula, and also they say, by the way, did you ever help out with that, that pension claim for this soldier, writing back and forth. And Somerset's in a really good place to do this because he's responsible for a lot of the Army's administration as the military secretary. You may also know him by his later name, Lord Raglan. He commanded the British forces in the Crimean War at the end of his life. So Somerset arranges for Byfield's case to be reconsidered by the Chelsea commissioners. He gets a medical re-examination done, and then finally the veteran is granted an increased pension of £1 a day, 3 pence more. It's what he wanted. He's very happy with that. But a little while later, a couple of years later, he comes back, Byfield, to Napier and Somerset, and then they're able to help him out with getting unclaimed prize money, essentially the value of enemy stores, things that were captured at the Battle of Detroit. He never received those earnings for the siege. He was left off the prize lists. And so then there's a whole kind of several-year endeavor where these two very well-connected men are riding off to Canada. They're riding off to India where the regiment's stationed. Problem is a lot of these officers have now died. It's the late 1830s, or they say, I can't remember a particular private soldier. And it takes them more than 4 years to actually find an officer who can say, yes, Byfield was there at Detroit, he gets his money, and he's able to claim £4 in compensation. But a huge amount of work. You can see, an ordinary soldier with maybe not these connections, if they had a similar administrative error, probably wouldn't get anywhere near as far. But I think besides, going to bat for Byfield in his battles with Chelsea Hospital, Napier is significant because Byfield's writings might never have appeared in print without Napier's intervention. The old soldier, Byfield, he'd at some point learned to write. I wish I know exactly how that happened, but he learns to write, and he writes in his second memoir about how he pens a summary of his service during the War of 1812 as a token of thanks for his patron, as a thank you for Napier. But then he later learns that Napier had facilitated its publication in a very popular periodical, a very popular magazine called the United Service Journal, very popular with old Army officers. Now, Byfield is pleased to receive the author's fee. He thinks that's great, but he also feels vexed that Napier had publicized what he only considered, quote, an imperfect sketch, just something he jotted off quickly without his knowledge. The veteran then resolves to write what he called a full and correct account of his military experiences. He wants to do it properly, write at greater length, to have it take some time with it. He finishes that in 1839, and then has it published the following year. And I actually managed to find a draft of in Byfield's own handwriting of this memoir in Napier's papers at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. Napier, being a good historian, doesn't seem to have thrown very much away. It was pretty tremendous to be able to find that, especially given the assumptions being he was illiterate, and this is actually written in Byfield's own hand. You can see his signature, a disabled soldier, and then the published version with a local printer published slightly thereafter. Now, Byfield was praised in his army discharge, which I've shown a few slides earlier. That's the discharge paper there. He's praised by one of his officers as a brave soldier. And certainly the 1840 narrative portrays an author who is gallant, who's steadfast, and is scrupulous. We read of him spurning opportunities for desertion, shaming a comrade intent on sitting out a battle, and even scorning other men for plundering the baggage of one of their commanding officers after defeat. After being wounded in the neck at the Battle of Frenchtown in 1813, Byfield claimed to have refused aid from a sergeant, declaring, quote, never mind me, go and help the men, while making his way to the hospital on his hands and knees through the snow. Byfield's depictions of undoubtedly distressing events, like the fatal accident that befell his brother in 1812, are remarkably terse and matter-of-fact. Even when it comes to the amputation of his forearm, Byfield simply writes, quote, the doctors prepared to blind me and had men to hold me, but I told them there was no need of that. The operation was tedious and painful, but I was enabled to bear it pretty well. He then goes on to remember playing a game of handball with his remaining limbs within days of the operation. So little wonder then that Byfield has often been described as an exemplar of stoic endurance, tough as nails, in the words of one historian. And I think there's a lot to that. But on the other hand, if we read closely the narrative, we can see some grimly indelible evidence of the trauma, the emotional toll of war. Byfield recalls, for example, being deeply moved by a wounded midshipman crying out for his mother in a regimental hospital. He also remembers shedding tears on hearing a refugee describe the death of his entire family at the hands of indigenous warriors. And these passages mirror actually the broader prevalence of emotional responses, very much including weeping, from Wellington on down in British military memoirs, which was a product of the culture at the time, what's sometimes called sensibility, which is all about emphasizing sensitivity to the carnage of war. As one historian has argued, literary depictions of 19th century British soldiers are sometimes showing them as models of uncomplaining fortitude, but they also coexist with portrayals of what she calls the military man of feeling, with soldiers being portrayed as sympathetic and humane rather than as callous figures entirely desensitized to the violence that they were experiencing and witnessing. Byfield also condemns what he called the cruelty of the indigenous warriors fighting alongside the British. So the indigenous people are very important as allies alongside the outnumbered British garrisons at this time. But they're quite uncomfortable about the vengeful violence that these warriors sometimes mete out against American prisoners who'd already surrendered. And Byfield, in his memoir, as with other British accounts of these campaigns, especially mentions Patrick Russell, who's a comrade who actually tries to intervene. A British soldier, private soldier, tries to intervene when indigenous warriors are killing American prisoners, and he's actually killed himself. And this is a pretty traumatic event for those who see it. Now, these passages about the indigenous violence, they mirror the British memoirs that are being written around the same time about the Peninsular War, which profess shock and dismay of Iberian, of Spanish and Portuguese reprisals against wounded and captured Frenchmen, who again, there's often no quarter for prisoners. These accounts clearly reflect, and I think, revulsion at well-documented instances of violence. These things definitely occurred. But they also did allow, we have to recognize, British professional soldiers to portray themselves in their own accounts in a flattering light. They could say, we were disgusted by that, we would never do such a thing, we're honorable combatants who are intent on upholding the customs of civilized warfare. But this declared commitment to clemency and restraint was, alas, not always absolute in practice. In the brief memoir which appeared in the United Service Journal in 1836, so the previous shorter version that Byfield wrote, he reported that one of his officers had instructed him to execute an American prisoner taken during a running battle in the woods. Now, interestingly, no mention of this order, which Byfield insisted he'd refused and disobeyed, no mention of this order is made in this longer narrative, which is generally a lot more detailed. The word count is much higher. It's interesting that gets excised, and the focus then is on the cruelty of the indigenous warriors, and omitting this sort of arguably somewhat similar instance when one of his own officers told him to do something quite similar. Finally, Byfield's memoirs reveal how the veteran made sense of his military experiences in religious terms. While the narrative's main text doesn't really contain that many obvious spiritual references, in a coda, the veteran observes that, quote, "a kind providence has preserved my life through the many dangers to which I've been exposed, and has brought me back to my native home." In other words, Byfield has been protected by God in war, and he's been allowed to find faith on his return, preparing the veteran for his eventual ascent into heaven. Quote, "where war shall be known no more, and where I shall be beyond the gunshot of every enemy." That's how Byfield ends his memoir. Despite widespread contemporary concerns about the lack of religiosity, about irreligion in the army, repeated brushes with death could instill an acute sense of the providential in some soldiers, as historians have argued. Veteran authors routinely echoed the conventions of the spiritual autobiography by interpreting their wartime travails and impairments as precursors to eventual Christian redemption. Just as we can see among 19th century miners, disabling accidents could be understood as divine deliverances or faith-intensifying trials. Now, the publication of Byfield's memoir, though, unfortunately, was by no means a marker of the end of the former soldier's tribulations. He struggles to find employment after the failure of local textile firms in 1841, and like many Bradford weavers, is forced to relocate. Byfield briefly resorts to working as a tollkeeper at a toll house. You can see one pictured on the screen. This pays really poorly, but he was at least able to supplement his income by selling copies of his printed narrative for $1 apiece. And one day, at the Turnpike Gate in Acton Turville in Gloucestershire, Byfield sells his memoirs to an especially eminent passerby, the Duke of Beaufort, who happens to be kind of the biggest landowner in the area. Now, Beaufort is a nephew of Lord Fitzroy Somerset, so that they're all connected, the Somerset family here. He's a veteran of the Peninsular War himself, and he becomes another of Byfield's patrons. The disabled veteran, having sold the memoir, then repeatedly goes to the aristocrat or his family to ask for employment, and eventually he secures a position as a gardener on Beaufort's estate near Badminton, called Badminton House. As Byfield claimed in his second memoir, though, he made an enemy of the Duke's steward, who somehow doubted the value of a one-handed manual laborer, and initially refused to pay the full wages of 9 shillings a week, as the veteran was also drawing a military pension. This is something a number of veterans complain about. Their employers know that they're getting a pension as well, and they're saying, well, we're not going to pay you the full wages because you've already got a top-up somewhere else. I think that's not fair. I should be getting the same amount. My pension shouldn't be held against me. Now, Byfield eventually learns of local plans to build a monument to Lord Edward Somerset. Somerset was the late brother of Lord Fitzroy Somerset, so Lord Raglan, who we encountered earlier. He's also an uncle of the Duke of Beaufort. And Somerset, Lord Edward Somerset, whose one of his swords is actually displayed upstairs in I think the Conflict in Europe gallery, he'd as well. He'd fought at Waterloo, commanded the cavalry there. Now, Byfield successfully petitions to be made the caretaker of this 100-foot monument, which is completed in honor of Lord Edward Somerset in the Gloucestershire village of Hawkesbury Upton in 1845. And then Byfield is able to take up residence in a specially built keeper's cottage at the base. Byfield's appointment, I think, reflects a more general trend of rewarding favored veterans with positions of trust and responsibility, including employment, say, as policemen, as workhouse officials, even as custodians of historic and military monuments. So, for example, the Duke of Wellington becomes the constable, rather, of the Tower of London in 1826. And he's the one who abolishes the sale of the office of yeoman warder, where previously you could just sell it or give it to your friends. And he says, no, we've got to give these jobs to ex-soldiers. The beefeaters will be veterans of my army. And this is a tradition, of course, that continues to today. Veterans are still the beefeaters, still the yeoman warders at the Tower of London. In the 1820s is when it begins with Wellington. Another survivor of the Peninsular campaigns is made keeper of Carnarvon Castle in Wales. But then, unfortunately, after just a year, he's dismissed for, and I love this, behaving rudely to, quote, painters, teetotalers, and American tourists. And several other veterans, too, are tasked with looking after newly built columns and obelisks, honoring admirals and generals with whom they'd fought, serving as really living extensions of the physical monuments in the eyes of visitors. You can see a few examples here. We've got Great Yarmouth, where a Trafalgar veteran is made the caretaker there. Lord Hill's column, where several soldiers who've been his manservant are in succession, are in charge of that column, which is dedicated to Rowland Hill, one of Wellington's deputies. The Ross Monument, Robert Ross is killed outside Baltimore in the War of 1812. He's previously best known for having burned down the White House at the end of the War of 1812. A monument is built to him near his family estates in what's now Northern Ireland. And here's actually an image which was put in the sitting room of the caretaker's house of Andrew Robb, who was the keeper, and would kind of go up to visitors and say, welcome. This is the monument to Robert Ross, and I saw him fall. I fought with him. This is sort of a huge element of bringing that history home to visitors. And Byfield, he hadn't fought at Waterloo himself, but he's still a veteran of these conflicts, who's able to interpret this site in Hawkesbury Upton. And what he does, he's got fairly light duties. He's got to maintain the tower. We can see there's some receipts for him buying sort of brushes, brooms, pails, that sort of thing. He has to sell souvenir booklets, which have a little biography of Lord Edward Somerset. And he has to welcome sightseers 6 days a week, excluding Sunday, of course. And these are pretty easy things for an old soldier who's been troubled, as he would later write in one of his memoirs, by violent rheumatic attacks because of the wound in his shoulder, the time he'd been shot in the neck. He talks about how he can barely, with his one good arm, raise a teacup to his lips because of the pain from his wound that he'd survived 30 years before. Now, while he's in Hawkesbury Upton in Gloucestershire, Byfield publishes yet another memoir, which is entitled History and Conversion of a British Soldier. Now, the only known copy of this is held in Cleveland, Ohio, in the Western Reserve Historical Society Library. And it was one of those amazing things where I was looking at an online catalog, trying to figure out which libraries had copies of the first version of Byfield's memoir, and I saw that there was something on the catalog that had a different title, but by the same author, and different publication date. I thought, oh goodness, I need to know a bit more about that. So this book he publishes in 1851, 11 years after his first book-length memoir. It contains a reprint of that military narrative, but it also has a later account of his post-war experiences as a homecoming soldier. And this is very much one that fits within the genre of a spiritual autobiography. He describes divine visions. He describes the comforting consolation of Scripture. He describes periodic spiritual lapses or backsliding when he doesn't do as well as he'd like. He has to sort of pray for forgiveness. And he extols he is grateful for various escapes from misfortune that he feels he's had due to divine benevolence. But if we look at these biographies, if we compare them side by side, there are some striking omissions and differences. And I think these underscore how the veteran's writings are influenced by the audience he's writing for, the objectives, and also the kind of conventions of the genre, whether it's a military memoir or spiritual biography. So in the first memoir, he's writing it, of course, to impress patrons by presenting himself as a deserving and dutiful veteran. But in the History and Conversion, he is sketching his own progress from a rebellious sinner to someone who becomes a devout believer. So as proof of God's watchful care, in Byfield's words, even during his wayward youth, Byfield recalls accompanying fellow soldiers on a looting expedition in Canada, basically stealing from private homes. Although then they see a dog in the door, they realize the dog's going to bark, and then they decide, we'll back off. We might get heard. We might get detected. He also describes another instance where he quits camp without leave, and that they're away overnight, and they come back just in time for roll call. And if they hadn't, they would have been punished very, very severely. So both these times, he sort of feels he's had a hair's breadth escape from a very serious potential punishment when he was young and foolish, and is grateful for having been delivered from such circumstances. Now, these are obviously memorable instances decades later, but they're unflattering, and they go unmentioned in the previous memoirs, despite the fact that Byfield had described those memoirs as unvarnished or as full and correct accounts. It's maybe understandable, but it's interesting that we can actually show some decisions he's making about what to withhold and what to include. The second memoir also provides contrasting perspectives on other aspects of Byfield's life. So there's a storm during the 1815 voyage home from Canada. This is barely mentioned in the memoir. It's an aside in the first memoir, the narrative. But it takes on fresh significance in the second memoir as the brush with death that occasions Byfield's first pangs of piety, that makes him start thinking seriously about religion. While Byfield describes maintaining his family comfortably, in his words, for nearly 20 years as a weaver at the end of his 1840 autobiography, that one was endorsed by the mill owner who employed him. And in this second memoir, he instead dwells on periods of indebtedness, of adversity, and underemployment, which is maybe something you wouldn't want to sort of say in an account that your employer is reading. And of course, in the second memoir, these stories of hardship, they clearly reflect the reality of working class life, the sort of hard-scrabble existence, the having to make do at times. But they also, I think, reflect the tendency of spiritual autobiographies to present earthly existence as a succession of trials endured in preparation for eternal life, for eternal rest. So you're having to kind of play up to the genre to an extent as well. I'm kind of mindful of what people expect to be reading. While History and Conversion portrays the author as a reformed Christian, ensuing events in Hawkesbury Upton, alas, they cast Byfield in a rather less flattering light. And hold on to your hats, ladies and gentlemen. His second memoir alludes to a rift between members of the village's particular Baptist chapel, which he was involved in, occasioned by disagreements over the theology and personality of the minister. This feud, it involves lawsuits, it involves arson, it involves assault and vandalism, and it eventually culminates in an unholy riot as the factions literally vie for control of the pulpit. So they're literally having a brawl over who gets to stand in the pulpit. Now, Byfield himself is accused of beginning this final row by pushing about, and then he allegedly slashes the eye and face of an opponent with the iron hook that he is then wearing as a prosthesis. Now, the next day, the veteran is served summons by a police sergeant who'd also previously arrested Byfield for public drunkenness. Byfield and two companions responded with what the police officer called, quote, torrents of abuse, such as I have never received before during the 11 years I have been in the Gloucestershire Constabulary Force. He reported how he'd been spat on, chased into the street. Now, if Byfield's lawyers were here, they'd no doubt be very keen for me to point out that he was not convicted of any of this. He was charged with forcible entry, charged with assault, but all parties that were charged in connection with his chapel business were acquitted as part of an agreement to refer the underlying dispute over who had control over the chapel to arbitration. That said, the veteran's conduct clearly did not escape the ire of his employer. 18 parishioners petitioned the Duke of Beaufort to dismiss Byfield from his post at the monument for, quote, being at the head of so much disturbance in the village. The veteran's employment was terminated in July 1853, just a few weeks after the chapel riot. So less is known about the last decades of Byfield's life. He returns to Bradford-on-Avon, his hometown, in 1856. He remarries 5 years later, following the death of his first wife. Though deprived of his post as the monument keeper, Byfield still enjoys the patronage of Sir William Napier, who sent the veteran an annual allowance for the rest of his life, for the rest of Napier's life. And among the many distinguished veterans who attended Napier's funeral in 1860, one man's name was, quote, specially recorded by the obituarists and biographers of this historian. And that man was Shadrack Byfield, quote, a war-worn pensioner who traveled to London for the purpose of following his benefactor to the grave. And Byfield himself actually gets himself into the local newspapers in Wiltshire. On hearing of Napier's death, he says, I will go at the funeral, even if I have to walk there the whole way myself. Now, Napier's daughter, Emily, is especially appreciative that Byfield took the trouble to come all the way, given her father's abiding concern for the welfare of enlisted men. And she writes, quote, what was nearest to our hearts of all, an old pensioner came all the way from Bradford-on-Avon to London. I would not have had my father laid to rest without one soldier from the ranks present. Now, Byfield applied unsuccessfully for further pension increases, and by 1867, he's selling yet another memoir. entitled The Forlorn Hope. You can see an advertisement about it, a snippet from a newspaper on the screen. Now, no copies of this publication survive. I think that's unfortunate, not least because I'd love to know how he explained the chapel business away. But a local newspaper described how it relates the Christian experience of this Wiltshire hero and the great persecutions and trials that he has passed through. Readers were urged to purchase copies to help the veteran, quote, obtain an honest livelihood in his declining days. Byfield was still sharing his life story in October of 1873 when another local paper served notice that the old soldier would be relating his, quote, experience of the kind providence of God in a public talk in Bradford's town hall. But then the veteran died the following January, aged 84. So having explored Byfield's eventful, often colorful life, I'll close by trying to reflect on the broader implications of this research. In my presentation, I've tried to offer exceptionally detailed information and insight into the genesis of one particular veteran's autobiography and drawn comparisons between the different memoirs he wrote. Clearly, Byfield's narrative is a rare and a valuable account of a British soldier's experience of the War of 1812. But it's clearly not a warts-and-all portrait, as one of Byfield's recent editors has claimed. Byfield described his published recollections as unvarnished or as plain and simple narratives, in keeping with the broader tendency of military autobiographers to emphasize the authenticity of their accounts by presenting themselves as amateur authors, unversed in literary artifice. So you'll often get a prologue, whether it's an officer or an ordinary soldier, who'll say, I'm just an unlettered soldier, I'm not a professional writer, forgive any faults with the prose, but at least I'm not embroidering the story. I'm giving you the real deal, unfiltered, as I saw it. It's a way of kind of reassuring the public that this isn't fiction, this is what I went through. Despite these pretensions of plain-spokenness, though, we've seen that Byfield passed over transgressions which would have undermined his image as a dutiful soldier, only to include these episodes in a later memoir with different narrative demands that very much then wanted I was a sinner and now I've improved, I've seen the light, but God was protecting me all along. And so suddenly those less flattering incidents now are relevant to the story. Like other veteran authors, Byfield very much recognized the economic value of his war stories. He disseminated accounts of his steadfast service and suffering, not only to earn money directly from their sale, but also to cultivate the support of potential benefactors. We can think of this memoir as a kind of CV, where he's out the turnpike gate with the Duke of Beaufort saying, this is what I went through, have my memoir. They'll read it, and hopefully, as it did turn out in the case of Beaufort, he'll become a patron, he'll maybe help Byfield out along the way. So he's trying to sort of obviously present his best self. It's worth emphasizing that Byfield's efforts to secure recognition and patronage through his writings were actually really notably successful. And that's maybe not necessarily surprising, but kind of interesting to note. He wasn't at Waterloo, he wasn't at the more famous campaigns, he'd fought in relatively obscure colonial battles, but he's still able to find philanthropists, to find support, and to find readers for his story. Nevertheless, we should also recognize that this old soldier's interest in war writing was not simply financial. His dismay over the unauthorized publication of a brief memoir in the United Service Journal reveals a desire to present a considered record of his military experiences on his own terms. So he might not be completely candid, but he wants to write a longer version. If he'd known it was going to come before the public, he would have done a better job, written a longer story. And I think this anxiety to kind of control his public image in the buoyant media landscape, the expanding print culture of the day, we can see it, we can compare it to the efforts of Georgian celebrities, but also even celebrities now, to kind of stage manage their reputations through their autobiographies. But it also mirrors the efforts of military personnel, very much up to and including the Duke of Wellington, to kind of influence how their wartime accomplishments were remembered on the national stage. So you may know the Cyborn model of Waterloo upstairs. Well, that's actually very unpopular with other officers when it's initially created, because it depicts the moments when the Prussians are storming onto the battlefield. And some officers, I think including Wellington, thinks it gives the Prussians too much credit. And later Cyborn, who's an army officer himself, is forced to redesign it a bit to take the Prussians out. And then suddenly all the officers who were refusing to visit are now more friendly to the model. We can even look at William Napier, who's writing these histories. Of course, the perils of writing history when people are still alive. An officer in India reads that he'd been basically accused in Napier's history of having mishandled a regiment at a battle in the peninsula, and he writes challenging Napier to a duel. So again, an attempt to kind of make sure that to intervene and to make sure that the story they want to get across, their truth as they saw it, in modern terms, was the one that was going to prevail. And Byfield is doing that in his own way. Byfield's story, I think, also helps us understand how veterans who faced life-changing injuries coped with their disabilities. And this is in a time, of course, when prostheses and the like were a lot more primitive than today. The Marquis of Anglesey, previously known as Lord Uxbridge, who I mentioned earlier, he famously relies on an innovative series of artificial limbs or legs to replace the limb he lost at Waterloo. You can see one of several examples. We also know of a one-armed army captain who lost his arm at Vittoria. You can see him on the slide. He designed an ingenious array of gadgets to help him complete everyday tasks, from eating eggs to sharpening quills. And you can see here we have the sort of egg holder. Here we have the sort of combined knife and fork. Nelson had a similar one, the quill sharpener there. You've got the gimbal and the vise, which you could sort of stick up against a table, sort of screw it in, and then put your egg cup holder there so it doesn't move around when you're trying to beat the egg with one hand. This is my favorite. This is a playing card holder, sort of when you're playing card games. I mean, incredibly ingenious and amusing, but also a sort of remarkable reminder of just how if you lose one of your arms, suddenly a lot of tasks get more difficult. And Terenzi is writing this as an officer who's unmarried, who is maybe not able to afford servants, and is basically saying, suddenly if you've got to do all these things yourself, suddenly having these gadgets can help for jobs that really do need two hands. Now, these are great examples, but of course, these are costly, and as some of the reviewers of Terenzi's book point out, these are complex contraptions, they're costly, they have to be custom made, they're not generally accessible to most war amputees, who either did without or they had to rely on simple prostheses like peg legs or iron hooks, the one that we know Byfield was wearing, and some of these were actually supplied by the Royal Hospital Chelsea. And it just, as an aside, sometimes worth noting, there are some officers who say, and common soldiers say, I actually bought the more expensive cork leg, the articulated one there, I bought the peg leg, I actually prefer the peg leg, so it wasn't necessarily the case that more expensive was better. But certainly, those from the ranks have less resources to be able to sort of custom build things. There's a very funny popular song from the 1830s about a Waterloo veteran who's fitted with a steam-powered arm, prosthetic arm, but then it becomes uncontrollable and it starts attacking people, and it attacks his wife, it attacks the mayor, it attacks the policemen when they're trying to sort of restrain it, it just sort of damages all their crockery. It's great fun, but alas, clearly kind of steampunk avant la lettre, not something that was really practical. What I think is interesting about Byfield, by contrast, is that we actually have some unique evidence of an ordinary soldier, an enlisted man who's able to design his own prosthesis and operate it himself to be able to become more self-sufficient. I think that's pretty remarkable. At the same time, we can also see through his experiences, the importance of both a state pension and philanthropic aid, and helping top that up and helping disabled veterans reintegrate into society, even though, of course, it's still not easy. The historian David Turner has contended that disabled people in 18th century England articulated what he called a powerful sense of entitlement to assistance. And other historians have shown how serving soldiers petitioned and negotiated with their officers in pursuit of what they considered to be fair treatment. So even though there's a harsh disciplinary regime in theory at the time, sometimes soldiers will say, we're going on strike, we're not happy with this, our rations have deteriorated, or you're trying to send us to India when we only agreed to serve in Europe. And the officers can't flog everyone, they have to then sort of have a negotiation, and very often a compromise is reached, or they have to give in to the soldiers' demands. And we can see that veterans, in a similar way, likewise kind of combine deference and assertiveness when they're pursuing redress. Like other discharged soldiers who are seeking to increase their pensions, Byfield actively seeks out the help of former officers, the help of local officials and elites, and therefore he's kind of, you could say he's mirroring the relationships with his patrons that look a lot like the military's own hierarchy. He's going to officers who would have commanded men like him and finding a sort of relationship which is sort of deferential, but they're going to help him out too, and trying to find old officers who sympathize. So you can see how that sort of military hierarchy, that paternalistic spirit of officers who have a lot of power over their men but are also expected to care for their needs, that's something that sort of carries on in the post-war world, and these veterans are going to look to a local retired major as their contact, their in with Chelsea. We could see examples from other veterans, too, who do that. But we can also see how veterans stake a broader claim to public sympathy through their published writings, presenting themselves as a distinct group with a special entitlement to state assistance. They feel they deserve it, they've done something right, and they're going to make that known to the public. As one former private observed in his own 1823 memoir, quote, "There are many persons who complain of the soldier's pension, but let them endure the hardships and fatigues of war in different climates, and they will not begrudge a poor soldier his stipend." Other rank-and-file authors decried the inadequacy, as they perceived it, of these benefits, or they accused society in general of being kind of indifferent to their plight, of not giving them enough, of casting them off. And this can be seen as kind of contributing to what one historian has called a dissident tradition of war writing that contrasts with the more upbeat narratives that a lot of junior officers are writing in the decades after the Napoleonic Wars. We can also see this groundswell of the rank-and-file military memoirs that are coming out in significant numbers, certainly dozens, probably at least 100 or two in the decades after 1815. These must be understood in the context of a commemorative culture that is lionizing commanders, but granting pretty limited recognition to ordinary servicemen. So you'll have seen those monuments earlier. Byfield and company are kind of interpreting the monuments. They're the custodians, but the monument is to the admiral. The monument is to the general. They're not sort of listing all of the names of the dead, regardless of rank, on the wall, as they would do in the 20th century. So without these memorials that are commemorating all ranks by name, these accounts written by private soldiers, we can see them as highlighting the suffering that they faced, a way of honoring lost comrades, and also kind of carving out a place for themselves, for the authors in the public memory of Britain's wars. And in the case of Byfield, he's kind of, because there were relatively few soldiers fighting in North America, he's almost monopoly in the market and has done actually pretty remarkably well in sort of getting himself in the public face of War of 1812 interpretation. More than 80,000 enlisted veterans drew British Army pensions in the 1820s. That rivals the number of serving soldiers at the time. There were almost as many pensioners as there were serving soldiers in the 1820s. And they occupied an ambiguous position between the military and civilian worlds. So Byfield has lost an arm, but those who were able-bodied, they were liable to being called up again if there was some sort of concern about an insurrection or rebellion, and if they didn't, they'd lose their pension. So they're kind of still soldiers on a retainer, but they're also basically retired for the most part. And there are cases, too, where these veterans will go to political meetings that are sort of against the government. In Ireland, they'll go to the meetings of Daniel O'Connell, who's pushing for a separate Irish Parliament, and they're threatened with losing their pensions because they're sort of going to seditious meetings. But other people are saying, well, this is free speech, they've left the army, the Horse Guards shouldn't have still some sort of residual control over them. But they're in this weird position where they're still sort of quasi-soldiers, and yet they're also out. Byfield returns to his home community. He returns to his former trade, but he still has the physical scars of conflict. And he continues, I think, to identify strongly with his time in uniform. So according to History and Conversion, Byfield introduced himself as a soldier in his first meeting with Napier. He informs the Duke of Beaufort when appealing for higher wages that, quote, "I do call myself a soldier, and I shall call myself a soldier until the day of my death." When on trial for drunkenness in 1851, Byfield opened his defense by declaring that, quote, he had been a British soldier and he had fought for his king and country. Now, these statements can, of course, be interpreted as strategic ploys aimed at playing up to an ideal type of the deserving old soldier, or cultivating a sense of military fraternity with patrons who'd, of course, after all, served in the army themselves. And I think that's a fair interpretation, but they also seem to genuinely reflect Byfield's own self-identity. So it seems significant, for example, that Byfield's daughter listed her father's occupation on his death certificate, not as a weaver, not as a gardener, not as a monument keeper, but as, quote, private, late of the 41st Regiment of Foot, nearly 6 decades after Byfield was demobilized. Byfield doesn't seem to have been alone in this. Significant numbers of army pensioners in this period appear to have embraced their military pasts, forging what one Chelsea hospital official described as a sort of esprit de corps with veterans, other former soldiers in their communities. Although the Napoleonic Wars may not have spawned national veterans associations like the British Legion, ex-servicemen comprised recognizable and often respected constituencies in their localities for decades after Waterloo. Some of them formed friendly societies, local clubs or friendly societies. They dined on the anniversaries of battles, especially Waterloo. They collectively paraded through their towns on public occasions. Life was no doubt very hard for many, but the last survivors were saluted as living links to a glorious past. The newspaper which praised Byfield as a Wiltshire hero in 1867 eulogized other enlisted veterans of the Napoleonic Wars in similar terms. I think that Byfield's case illustrates the ambivalent and evolving image of the private soldier. He embodies what one historian has called the double-think delinquent hero perception of the army's rank and file, appearing variously as a distinguished hero, as a God-fearing Christian, and yes, at times as a kind of a quick-tempered miscreant. But Byfield's life also coincided with a gradual but unmistakable rise in the public sympathy and respect accorded to former soldiers. This is exemplified by more positive portrayals in art and literature, a great example being the museum exhibition upstairs on Victorian military art. And he also lived to see the award of the first official medals to all ranks. The Waterloo veterans received their medals shortly after the battle. Byfield and others, veterans of other major campaigns in the Napoleonic period, they had to wait till the 1840s for their medals. So a long wait, but they did get them eventually. So a big shift in how the British Army recognizes military service, and he receives the one for Fort Detroit. Much of this esteem, this enhanced esteem, it results from winning the war ultimately against Napoleon, a post-war climate of military reform, and also humanitarian concern for the plight of soldiers in the Crimea. But ex-soldiers who published accounts of their own time in uniform also inform public perceptions of the rank and file, not least through their interventions in debates over punishments, military punishments, and other army policies. Byfield's memoirs didn't directly discuss army reform, but they were nonetheless praised on their first appearance in the United Service Journal as representative of, quote, the character of the English common soldier. In fact, they were even invoked as a rejoinder to Prussian accusations that the British rank and file were unreliable men brutalized by unduly harsh discipline. This temptation to portray Byfield as the archetype of an army, the representative of all his peers then, is clearly not just a modern, mostly Canadian phenomenon. But not all 19th century readers were convinced either. Another military magazine was more inclined to frame Byfield's self-portrait as an honorable exception rather than a general rule, pointing out that the corporal punishments which many British officers continued to defend would hardly be necessary if all soldiers were quite as honorable and dutiful and heroic as Byfield claimed to be. You might not be surprised to learn that this particular magazine was French, and they were saying, oh, the Grande Armée, Napoleon's troops, we did just as well in the last war. But Lord Fitzroy Somerset, he also implicitly characterized this veteran as impressive but unusual, informing Napier in 1836 that Byfield's, quote, very entertaining memoir was proof that the author was no common man. Now, I think Byfield in many ways was not a common man, but I also think I've made the case, far from being entirely atypical, that there are plenty of parallels between his story and that of the broader experiences of British veterans coming home from the Napoleonic Wars. Byfield's limb burial, his custom prosthesis, his commitment to serial autobiography certainly may have been exceptional, but the challenges he faced, like physical impairment, like economic insecurity, they were all too common among returning servicemen, both then and now, as was his interest, of course, in recounting war stories and securing recognition for what he'd been through. Byfield's memoirs offer an important story of the battles he was in, but their value doesn't stop there. They reveal how a veteran made sense of his military past in hindsight and chose to present that past for public consumption. If it's true that all wars are fought twice, the first time on the battlefield and the second time in memory, then I think Byfield's story gives us a vivid reminder that veterans could be as active and as determined in prosecuting the second conflict as they had been in the first. Thanks very much.